The morning light came through the window of room 317 in thin, pale ribbons, falling across the linoleum floor in a pattern that Eleanor Vance had memorized years ago. She had been a nurse on this ward for nearly 6 years, and the way the sun hit the wax tile at 6:45 in the morning had become a quiet anchor in her daily routine. The med cart stood ready beside her hip, its wheels freshly oiled, the little drawers labeled with neat handwritten tags. She checked the IV bag hanging beside Mr. Kowalski's bed, her fingers moving with the automatic precision that only came from thousands of repetitions, and made a small adjustment to the drip rate. The patient slept on, his chest rising and falling under the thin hospital blanket, his face slack with the peace that morphine brought to a man in his final months. Eleanor lingered for a moment, watching the steady rhythm of his breath, and then she moved on. She always moved on. The hallway outside stretched in both directions, lined with doors that opened onto similar rooms, each one holding a veteran in some stage of recovery or decline. The Truman Veterans Affairs Medical Center sat on the eastern edge of Columbia, Missouri, a sprawling complex of beige buildings and manicured lawns that had been her professional home for nearly a decade. She had started here as a nursing assistant when she was 24. Fresh out of the Army with a medical discharge she still had trouble talking about, and had worked her way up to registered nurse with a quiet determination that impressed her supervisors. She was 37 now, older than most of the other nurses on the floor, and she carried herself with a stillness that some people mistook for shyness and others for aloofness. The truth was more complicated, and it lived in the web of scars that covered the left side of her body from shoulder to hip. The scars were the first thing people noticed about Eleanor Vance, though most tried very hard not to look. They were strange scars, not the clean lines of surgical incisions or the puckered circles of bullet wounds. They twisted across her skin in patterns that seemed almost deliberate, raised and irregular, some silvery with age and others still faintly pink even after all these years. In the summer, when the Missouri heat made long sleeves unbearable, she would catch patients staring at the marks that crept up past her collar toward her jawline. She had learned to ignore the stares, to answer the unasked questions with a polite smile and a change of subject. Over time, she had developed a kind of emotional callus, a protective barrier that allowed her to do her job without letting the curiosity of strangers burrow into her heart. But some days, the callus wore thin. Some days she would come home to her small apartment on the south side of town, close the door behind her, and stand in the silence for a long time before she could bring herself to turn on the lights. She had a cat, a fat orange tabby named Gus, who had appeared on her doorstep during a thunderstorm 3 years ago and never left. Gus was the only living creature who had seen her cry since she left the Army, and even he had witnessed it only twice. Eleanor Vance did not cry easily, and she did not talk about the past. She had built a life on the foundation of not talking about the past, and for the most part it held. The morning shift change happened at 7, and Eleanor gathered with the other nurses in the break room to receive the overnight report. The break room was a small, windowless space with a coffee maker that had been making terrible coffee since the Clinton administration, and a bulletin board covered with safety notices and union announcements. Eleanor took her usual seat at the corner of the table, a paper cup of the terrible coffee in her hand, and listened as the night nurse ran through the status of each patient. There were no surprises. Mr. Kowalski had slept through the night. Mrs. Henderson's blood pressure was elevated but stable. Mr. Davies had been agitated around 3 in the morning and had required a sedative. Eleanor noted each detail in her small notebook, her handwriting precise and economical. The charge nurse for the day shift was a woman named Darlene Croft, a heavyset woman in her early 50s who had been working at Truman for over 20 years. Darlene was efficient and knowledgeable, but she had a sharp tongue and a way of making people feel small that had earned her the quiet resentment of nearly every nurse on the floor. She sat at the head of the table, her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose, and listened to the night report with an expression of barely concealed impatience. When the night nurse finished, Darlene removed her glasses and let them dangle from the chain around her neck. "All right," she said, her voice carrying the flat Midwestern accent that Eleanor had grown up hearing in rural Iowa. "Assignments. Eleanor, you've got 317 through 324. That's Kowalski, Henderson, Davies, and the new admission coming in this afternoon." She paused, glancing down at her clipboard. "New admission is a younger guy, early 40s, pancreatic cancer. He's been at Walter Reed for the past 2 months, and he's being transferred here because his family lives in Jefferson City. He's not happy about it, they never are." Eleanor nodded, making another note in her book. "I'll make sure his room is ready." "See that you do." Darlene's gaze flicked to Eleanor's neck, where the edge of a scar was visible above her scrub collar, and then away just as quickly. It was the kind of glance Eleanor had received 1,000 times, the involuntary look followed by the deliberate act of pretending not to have looked. Darlene had never asked about the scars, not once in all the years they had worked together, and Eleanor had never volunteered an explanation. The silence between them on the subject was a kind of uneasy truce, an acknowledgement that some things were better left unexplored. The shift began like any other. Eleanor made her rounds, checking vital signs, administering medications, and talking to patients in the calm, measured voice that had become her professional signature. Mr. Kowalski was awake now, an 83-year-old Korean War veteran with emphysema and a wry sense of humor that the morphine had not entirely dulled. He told her a joke about a priest and a rabbi that she had heard at least 6 times before, and she laughed at the right places and adjusted his pillow before moving on to Mrs. Henderson's room. Mrs. Henderson was a 70-year-old widow whose husband had served in Vietnam and who had been coming to the VA for her own care ever since his death. She was a sweet woman, talkative and lonely, and Eleanor always tried to spend a few extra minutes with her when the schedule allowed. It was in Mr. Davies' room that the first shadow of the day fell. Michael Davies was a 55-year-old Army veteran who had served in the Gulf War and who was being treated for complications from diabetes. He was not an easy patient. He complained about the food, the temperature of his room, the noise from the hallway, and the incompetence of every medical professional who had ever crossed his path. He had alienated most of the nursing staff within his first week on the floor, and Eleanor had become his primary caregiver largely because she was the only one willing to tolerate his moods without visible irritation. When she entered his room that morning, Mr. Davies was sitting up in bed, his breakfast tray untouched on the table beside him. He was a lean man with a weathered face and a bristling gray mustache, and his eyes followed Eleanor as she crossed the room with a sharpness that suggested he was looking for something to criticize. "Took you long enough," he said. "My pills are late." Eleanor glanced at the clock on the wall. "It's 8:15, Mr. Davies. Your medications are scheduled for 8:30. I'm actually early." "They should be at 8. That's what the doctor said." "I'll make a note of that and check with the doctor when he rounds this afternoon." She moved to check his IV, her hands steady and unhurried. "How is your pain this morning?" "Same as always, bad." He shifted in the bed, his gown pulling at the shoulder. "You'd think after all the money this place costs, they could hire nurses who know what they're doing." Eleanor did not react to the jab. She had heard worse from patients over the years, and she had learned that engagement was rarely productive. She finished her assessment, noted his vitals, and was turning to leave when Mr. Davies spoke again. "What happened to your neck?" The question came out flat and abrupt, without the embarrassed hesitation that most people displayed. Eleanor paused, her hand on the doorframe. She had been asked this question many times in many different ways, and she had a collection of stock answers that she deployed depending on the situation. But something in Mr. Davies' tone made her pause. There was a deliberate quality to the question, a probing edge that felt less like curiosity and more like a challenge. "An old injury," she said, keeping her voice neutral. "Is there anything else I can get you before I move on to my next patient?" "An old injury." He repeated the words with a faint sneer. That's what they all say. I've seen scars like that before, on some of the guys I served with. You know where they got them. Eleanor turned to face him fully, her expression unchanged. Mr. Davies, I really need to check on my other patients. I'll be back in an hour with your morning medications. They got them from doing stupid things, he continued, as if she had not spoken. Careless things. One guy I knew, he got scars like that from a fuel fire he started himself. Thought he was being a hero, messing around with equipment he didn't understand. Cost him half his skin and a dishonorable discharge. His eyes, pale and watery, fixed on her with an unsettling intensity. You serve. The question hung in the air between them. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to deflect and retreat. But she had never been one to lie, and she was not about to start now. Yes, she said, I served. Mr. Davies nodded slowly, his expression hardening into something that looked almost like satisfaction. Thought so. You've got that look. The VA's full of people like you, you know. People who did something they're not proud of and wound up with the scars to prove it. He leaned back against his pillows, his gaze never leaving her face. I don't judge, but I can always tell. Eleanor stood very still. She could feel her pulse in her throat, a steady, insistent beat that she had learned to control through years of practice. She thought about all the things she could say, the words that had lived inside her for so long without ever being spoken aloud. And then, as she always did, she let them go. I'll be back in an hour, she said, and she walked out of the room. The rest of the morning passed without incident, but Mr. Davies' words stayed with her, lodged in her mind like a splinter she could not quite reach. She went through the motions of her work, checking on patients, updating charts, consulting with the attending physician, but a part of her was somewhere else, somewhere far away and long ago. It happened sometimes, more often than she liked to admit. A comment, a look, a particular quality of light, and suddenly she would be back in the desert, the heat pressing down on her like a physical weight, the dust in her throat, the sound of voices speaking a language she had never fully learned. She had been out of the army for 13 years, but the past had a way of reaching into the present with long, patient fingers. At lunch, she sat in the cafeteria with a salad she did not particularly want and watched the other hospital employees move through the serving line. The cafeteria was a large, fluorescent-lit space that smelled of industrial cleaner and whatever had been frying in the kitchen. She usually ate alone, not because she was unfriendly, but because she preferred the quiet. A few of the other nurses had invited her to join them over the years, and she had accepted occasionally, but she had never become part of any particular social circle. She was known on the floor as a competent nurse and a private person, and that was how she liked it. Today, however, her solitude was interrupted. A young nursing assistant named Kevin Okonkwo appeared at her table, his tray balanced in one hand and a hopeful expression on his face. Kevin was 23 years old, tall and thin, with glasses that were always slipping down his nose, and an enthusiasm for the profession that had not yet been worn down by the realities of the job. He had been working at Truman for about 6 months, and Eleanor had noticed that he seemed to gravitate toward her, perhaps because she was one of the few nurses who never snapped at him. Mind if I sit here? He asked, already lowering his tray. Everywhere else is packed. Eleanor gestured to the empty chair across from her. Go ahead. Kevin sat down and immediately began talking, a steady stream of observations about his morning that required little response from Eleanor beyond the occasional nod. She half listened as she picked at her salad, her mind still circling around the encounter with Mr. Davies. Kevin was in the middle of a story about a patient who had tried to escape from the geriatric ward when he suddenly stopped and looked at her with a curious expression. Hey, are you okay? He asked. You seem kind of distracted. I'm fine, Eleanor said, just thinking. About what? She almost brushed him off with a vague answer, but something in his open, guileless face made her hesitate. Kevin was young and sometimes clumsy in his eagerness, but he was also kind in a way that felt genuine. She had seen him sit with dying patients who had no family, holding their hands and talking to them about baseball scores and the weather. He was not the type to mock or judge. "A patient said something this morning," she said, choosing her words carefully, "about my scars." Kevin's expression shifted to one of immediate concern. Who? What did they say? It doesn't matter who. He just assumed some things, made some comments. She shrugged, trying to make it seem smaller than it felt. It happens. "That's not right," Kevin said, his voice firm. "Patients shouldn't be talking to you like that. Did you report it?" "It wasn't a reportable offense. He was just being unpleasant. I've dealt with worse." Kevin frowned, stirring his soup absently. "I've always wondered about those scars," he said, and then immediately looked mortified. "I'm sorry that came out wrong. I didn't mean that in a bad way. I just meant that I can tell they're from something serious, and I've always thought it was none of my business to ask. But if you ever wanted to talk about it, I'd listen." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. His face was earnest, his eyes sincere, and she felt a small, unexpected warmth in her chest. She had spent so many years guarding herself that kindness, when it came, still had the power to surprise her. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Maybe someday." The afternoon brought the new admission, a man named Richard Calloway who arrived in a wheelchair pushed by a transport orderly from the airport. Mr. Calloway was 42 years old, a former Marine Corps officer who had been diagnosed with pancreatic cancer 6 months earlier and had been treated at Walter Reed until his family requested a transfer closer to home. He was thin and jaundiced, his skin the color of old newspaper, but his eyes were sharp and intelligent, and he watched Eleanor with a wariness that suggested he was still sizing up his new surroundings. Eleanor got him settled into room 324, the last room on her assignment list, and ran through the admission checklist with her usual thoroughness. Mr. Calloway's wife, a small, tired-looking woman named Patricia, sat in the chair beside his bed and asked a series of detailed questions about his care plan, the doctors who would be treating him, and the availability of pain management. Eleanor answered each question patiently, explaining the procedures and protocols in a way that was both professional and compassionate. By the time she was finished, Mrs. Calloway seemed slightly less anxious, and Mr. Calloway had relaxed enough to offer a thin smile. "You're good at this," he said, his voice raspy but clear. "Better than some of the nurses at Walter Reed, and those are top-notch people." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I've been doing it for a while." "How long?" "About 6 years here at Truman. Before that, I was a nursing assistant at a civilian hospital in Des Moines." Mr. Calloway tilted his head, studying her with the practiced assessment of someone who had spent a career evaluating people. "And before that, you've got the bearing of someone who served. Am I right?" Eleanor hesitated. She had already been asked the question once today, and she was not eager to revisit it. But Mr. Calloway's tone was different from Mr. Davies'. It was respectful, even collegial, the kind of question one veteran might ask another. "Yes," she said. "Army, I was a medic." He nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I thought so. There's something about the way you move, efficient, no wasted motion." He glanced at his wife, who was watching the exchange with quiet curiosity. "Pat, this nurse is a veteran. You can always tell." Mrs. Calloway smiled, a weary but genuine expression. "Thank you for your service," she said, the words coming out automatically, the way they always did. Eleanor acknowledged the thanks with a small nod. The way she always did. She had never quite known how to respond to that phrase, which had become ubiquitous in the years after the wars began. It was well-meaning, she knew, but it felt hollow to her, a ritual exchange that required nothing of either party. She had long ago stopped trying to explain that her service was not something she had given so much as something that had happened to her, a chapter in her life that she had survived rather than chosen. The rest of the afternoon went smoothly, and by the time the shift ended at 3:30, Eleanor was tired but not exhausted. She gave her report to the evening charge nurse, a calm and competent woman named Maria Gonzalez, and then changed out of her scrubs in the staff locker room. She wore a long-sleeved blouse and loose-fitting pants, clothes that covered her scars completely, and she caught a glimpse of herself in the mirror as she was closing her locker. Her reflection stared back at her with the same steady, unreadable expression she had worn all day. She looked older than 37, she thought, the lines around her eyes deeper than they should be, the gray in her light brown hair more noticeable than it had been a year ago. She looked like a woman who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time. She drove home through the quiet streets of Columbia, past the university campus and the tree-lined neighborhoods, and parked in the lot behind her apartment building. The building was a modest three-story structure with a brick facade and a small courtyard that no one ever used. Her apartment was on the second floor, a one-bedroom unit with a galley kitchen and a living room window that looked out onto a stand of maple trees. It was not much, but it was hers, and she had filled it with books and plants and the comfortable clutter of a life lived alone. Gus met her at the door, meowing loudly and winding around her ankles. She bent down to scratch behind his ears, feeling some of the tension of the day begin to ease. The apartment was quiet, the only sound the hum of the refrigerator and the distant noise of traffic from the main road. She fed Gus, changed into even looser clothes, and settled onto the couch with a book she had been trying to finish for weeks. But her mind would not settle. Mr. Davies, words kept replaying in her head, sharp and needling. People who did something they're not proud of, and wound up with the scars to prove it. She closed her book and stared at the ceiling. The scars on her body were not from carelessness or cowardice. They were not from a fuel fire started by incompetence. They were from something else entirely, something that she had locked away in the deepest part of her memory and tried very hard to forget. But the truth was that she could not forget, not entirely. The truth lived in her skin, in the patterns that twisted from her shoulder to her hip, and it surfaced in her dreams more often than she cared to admit. The phone rang at 7:30, startling her out of her reverie. She looked at the caller ID and saw a number she did not recognize, a Washington, D.C. area code. She considered not answering, but something made her pick up. "Hello. Is this Eleanor Vance?" The voice on the other end was male, crisp and professional. "Yes, who is this?" "Ms. Vance, my name is Lieutenant Colonel David Morrison. I'm calling from the office of the Secretary of Defense. I'm trying to reach Eleanor Vance, formerly a sergeant in the United States Army, service number redacted for privacy." Eleanor's heart began to beat faster. This is she. What is this about? "Ms. Vance, I've been asked to inform you that the Secretary of Defense will be visiting the Truman VA Medical Center next week. There's a matter of considerable importance that he wishes to discuss with you in person. I'm not at liberty to provide further details over the phone, but I can assure you that it's a matter of official recognition related to your service." The room seemed to tilt slightly. Eleanor gripped the phone tighter, her knuckles white. "Official recognition? I don't understand. I've been out of the Army for 13 years. "I'm aware, ma'am. The Secretary is aware as well. The details will be explained during his visit. I'm calling to confirm your presence at the medical center on the morning of the 24th and to ask that you make yourself available for a private meeting before the public ceremony." "Ceremony?" Eleanor's voice came out as a whisper. "Yes, ma'am. The Secretary will be presenting you with a decoration. I'm not authorized to say which one, but I can tell you that it's long overdue." There was a pause, and when Lieutenant Colonel Morrison spoke again, his voice had softened slightly. "I know this is probably a shock, Ms. Vance. I've been asked to convey the Secretary's personal respect and his gratitude for your patience. Everything will be made clear next week." Eleanor opened her mouth to respond, but no words came. She stood in her small living room, the phone pressed to her ear, the cat winding around her feet, and felt the past rush up to meet her like a wave she had been trying to outrun for more than a decade. "Ms. Vance, are you still there?" "Yes," she managed. "I'm here. I'll be there on the 24th. "Thank you, ma'am. Someone will be in touch with further details. Good evening." The line went dead. Eleanor lowered the phone and stared at it for a long time. Outside, the maple trees rustled in the evening breeze, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. The world went on, ordinary and indifferent, but something had shifted. Something was coming, and she did not know whether to be grateful or terrified. She sat down on the couch, her legs suddenly weak. Gus jumped up beside her and settled into his usual spot, his warm weight pressing against her thigh. She stroked his fur absently, her mind spinning. A decoration, the Secretary of Defense, after all these years. She thought about the scars on her body, the ones Mr. Davies had assumed were evidence of disgrace, and she felt something stir in her chest. It was not anger, not exactly. It was something closer to grief, the old grief that she had never fully allowed herself to feel. She had been silent for so long, invisible in her silence, and now the world was about to see her. The thought was terrifying and, in a way she could not quite articulate, a relief. The next few days at the hospital were strange, colored by the knowledge of what was coming. Eleanor told no one about the phone call, not Kevin, not Maria, not Darlene. She went about her work as she always did, methodical and calm, but inside she was vibrating with a tension that she could not seem to shake. She found herself looking at her patients differently, wondering which of them would be there on the day of the ceremony, wondering what they would think when they learned the truth. She thought about Mr. Davies and his sneering assumptions, and she thought about Mr. Calloway and his respectful curiosity, and she wondered if the truth would change anything at all. On Wednesday, 2 days before the scheduled visit, Darlene Croft stopped Eleanor in the hallway. The charge nurse's face was pinched with irritation, and she was holding a memo in her hand. "Did you know about this?" Darlene demanded, waving the paper. Eleanor looked at the memo, which bore the letterhead of the Department of Veterans Affairs and the Office of the Secretary of Defense. It announced a special visit and ceremony to be held in the hospital's main auditorium on Friday morning, and it requested the presence of all available staff. "I was informed," Eleanor said quietly. Darlene's eyes narrowed. "Informed? You were informed? This is a visit from the Secretary of Defense, Eleanor. Do you have any idea how much preparation this requires? Security clearances, logistical arrangements, protocol briefings, and you didn't think to mention it to me." "I was told to keep it confidential until the official announcement." "Confidential?" Darlene's voice dripped with skepticism. "And what exactly is this ceremony about? The memo doesn't say, it just says special recognition. Are you getting some kind of award?" Eleanor met her gaze steadily. "I don't have all the details yet." "You don't have the details." Darlene shook her head, her expression hardening. "You know, I've worked with you for 6 years, Eleanor, 6 years, and in all that time you've never once talked about your service. You've never explained those scars. And now suddenly the Secretary of Defense is coming to give you an award." She paused, and when she spoke again, her voice was lower, almost dangerous. "What did you do to deserve that?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implication. Eleanor felt the familiar tightening in her chest, but she did not look away. "I think you'll find out on Friday," she said. And she walked past Darlene and down the hall to her next patient. The encounter left her shaken, but also oddly resolved. Darlene's hostility was nothing new. The charge nurse had always been suspicious of Eleanor's privacy, as if her refusal to share personal details was somehow a personal affront. But now there was something else in the mix, a jealousy that Eleanor could almost see shimmering around Darlene like heat off asphalt. The Secretary of Defense was coming, and the spotlight was about to fall on Eleanor Vance, and Darlene did not like it one bit. Later that day, Kevin cornered her in the supply closet. He had heard the rumors, which had spread through the hospital like wildfire, and his eyes were wide with excitement. "Is it true?" he whispered, his voice barely containing his enthusiasm. "The Secretary of Defense is coming to give you a medal." "I don't know if it's a medal," Eleanor said, reaching past him for a box of gauze pads. "I just know there's a ceremony." "That's amazing. What did you do? Were you in combat? Did you save someone's life?" Eleanor hesitated. Kevin's excitement was genuine, and she did not want to crush it, but she was not ready to tell the story. She was not sure she would ever be ready. "It was a long time ago," she said. "I'm still processing it." Kevin's expression softened. "Okay, I get it, but whatever it is, I'm really proud of you, and I'm glad you're finally getting recognized." He paused, then added, "Maybe now people will think twice before they say stupid things about your scars." Eleanor looked at him, this young man who had no reason to be kind to her except that he was a kind person, and she felt a lump form in her throat. She swallowed it down. "Thank you, Kevin," she said. "That means more than you know." Thursday passed in a blur of preparation. Hospital administrators scurried around with clipboards and worried expressions, coordinating with the advanced security team that had arrived from Washington. The main auditorium was closed off for preparations, and rumors flew about what exactly was going to happen. Some people speculated that Eleanor was receiving a Purple Heart. Others guessed a Bronze Star. A few of the more cynical staff members suggested it was all a bureaucratic mix-up, that the secretary was coming for someone else, and Eleanor's name had gotten attached by mistake. Eleanor heard all of it, and she said nothing. On Thursday evening, she went home and sat on her couch and stared at the wall for a long time. She thought about the desert, about the heat and the dust and the sound of her own heartbeat in her ears. She thought about the people she had saved and the people she had lost. She thought about the pain, the kind of pain that had no words, the kind that had carved itself into her flesh and stayed there. And she thought about Mr. Davies and Darlene Croft and all the other people who had looked at her scars and assumed the worst. Tomorrow they would know the truth. Tomorrow everything would change. Gus jumped onto her lap and purred, his orange fur soft under her fingers. She sat there in the gathering darkness, stroking his back, and waited for the morning to come. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that made the Missouri countryside look like a postcard. Eleanor arrived at the hospital at 6 o'clock, 2 hours before her usual shift, because she had been asked to meet with the advance team for a final briefing. She wore her best set of scrubs, the ones without stains or frayed edges, and she had spent longer than usual on her hair, pulling it back into a neat bun that made her look, she thought, almost like the soldier she used to be. The security presence was impossible to miss. Black SUVs with government plates were parked near the main entrance, and men in dark suits with earpieces stood at strategic points around the building. The hospital's regular security guards looked slightly bewildered, as if they had shown up for a routine shift and found themselves in the middle of a movie set. Eleanor was met at the employee entrance by a young woman in a crisp business suit who introduced herself as Amanda Chen, a protocol officer from the secretary's staff. "Ms. Vance, thank you for coming in early," Amanda said, shaking her hand with brisk efficiency. "I'll walk you through the schedule for this morning. The secretary is arriving at 9:30. There will be a brief private meeting in the administrator's conference room at 9:45, followed by the public ceremony in the auditorium at 10. The ceremony is expected to last approximately 30 minutes, after which the secretary will need to depart immediately for another engagement." Eleanor nodded, absorbing the information. "What exactly is happening at the ceremony?" Amanda hesitated, a flicker of something, sympathy, perhaps, crossing her face. "I'm not authorized to give you the full details, Ms. Vance. The secretary wants to do that himself, but I can tell you that you're receiving the Distinguished Service Cross. It's the second highest military decoration for valor, and yours has been a long time coming." The words hit Eleanor like a physical blow. The Distinguished Service Cross. She had known soldiers who received that medal, soldiers who had done things that went far beyond the call of duty. She had never imagined that she belonged in their company. She had never imagined that anyone even knew what she had done. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did this happen, after all these years?" Amanda's expression grew more serious. "There was a review. A new witness came forward recently, someone who was present during the events in question. His testimony prompted the Army to reopen your case and reevaluate the original decision. The secretary was briefed on the findings 2 months ago, and he decided that he wanted to present the medal personally." Eleanor felt the world tilt again, just as it had during the phone call. A new witness. Someone who had been there. She thought about the people who had been with her that day, the ones who had survived and the ones who had not, and she felt a wave of emotion so powerful that she had to steady herself against the wall. "Who," she managed, "who was the witness?" "I'm not sure I'm at liberty to say," Amanda said gently, "but I believe he'll be at the ceremony. You'll have a chance to see him then." The private meeting in the administrator's conference room was scheduled for 9:45, but the waiting stretched out like an eternity. Eleanor went through the motions of her morning routine, checking on her patients with a focus that felt almost mechanical. Mr. Kowalski was awake and cheerful, and he asked her why there were so many men in suits wandering around the hospital. She told him there was a special visitor coming, and he launched into a story about meeting General Patton during the war that Eleanor suspected was heavily embellished. Mrs. Henderson wanted to know if the visitor was a celebrity, and Eleanor said no. It was a government official, which made Mrs. Henderson lose interest immediately. Mr. Calloway, however, was more perceptive. "I heard the Secretary of Defense is coming," he said when Eleanor entered his room to check his vitals, "and I heard it has something to do with you." His eyes, still sharp despite his illness, studied her face. "Is that true?" Eleanor did not see any point in denying it. "Yes." Mr. Calloway nodded slowly. "I had a feeling. When I first met you, I knew there was more to your story than you were letting on. You've got the look of someone who's been through something heavy." He paused, then added, "Whatever it is, I'm glad you're being recognized. Anyone who serves deserves that much." "Thank you," Eleanor said, and she meant it. There was one patient she did not visit that morning, and that was Mr. Davies. She told herself it was because she was running behind schedule that she would check on him after the ceremony, but the truth was that she could not face him. Not yet. His words from earlier in the week were still fresh in her mind, and she did not trust herself to maintain her professional composure if he said something else. She asked Kevin to cover his room, and Kevin agreed without hesitation. At 9:30, the hospital's main entrance was briefly closed as the secretary's motorcade arrived. Eleanor watched from a window on the second floor as the long black vehicles pulled up to the curb, and a cluster of aides and security personnel emerged, followed by a tall man in a dark suit whom she recognized from news photographs. Secretary Robert Haynes was a former Marine Corps general, a man with a square jaw and a no-nonsense demeanor who had served in the position for 3 years. He moved with the confident stride of someone accustomed to authority, and he disappeared into the building before Eleanor could see more. At 9:40 exactly, Amanda appeared at Eleanor's side and escorted her to the administrator's conference room on the 3rd floor. The room had been transformed for the occasion, the usual clutter of files and coffee cups replaced by a polished table and chairs arranged in a formal configuration. 2 flags stood in the corner, the American flag and the flag of the Department of Defense, and several men in military uniforms were standing near the window. Eleanor recognized the insignia of a lieutenant colonel on one of them, and she assumed he was the David Morrison who had called her. Secretary Haynes was standing at the head of the table, and when Eleanor entered, he turned to face her. Up close, he looked older than he did on television, his gray hair thinner and the lines on his face deeper. But his eyes were kind, and when he smiled, it was with genuine warmth. "Sergeant Vance," he said, extending his hand, Thank you for coming. I know this must be overwhelming. Eleanor shook his hand, her grip firm out of long habit. It is, sir. I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here. The secretary gestured for her to sit, and he took the chair beside her. The others in the room, Amanda, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, and a few other aides, remained standing at a respectful distance. I've read your file, Secretary Haynes said, his voice low and serious. The full file, not the redacted version. I know what happened in the Korangal Valley in October of 2011. I know what you did for your unit, and I know what it cost you. He paused, letting the words settle. What I don't know is why the Army didn't recognize your actions at the time. The original recommendation for a medal was denied, and your service record was flagged with a notation that I find deeply troubling. The review board that looked at your case last month concluded that the denial was unjustified and that the notation should be expunged. I agree with that conclusion. Eleanor's throat was tight. The Korangal Valley. She had not spoken those words aloud in years. The memories came flooding back, vivid and terrible, and she had to force herself to stay present, to not slip into the past. Sir, she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her, I didn't do anything that anyone else wouldn't have done. I was just doing my job. The secretary shook his head. That's what every hero says, but the facts speak for themselves. Your unit was ambushed. 11 soldiers were wounded in the initial attack, including your commanding officer. You were a medic, and you exposed yourself to sustained enemy fire for over 4 hours to treat the wounded and drag them to cover. You saved at least 7 lives that day, Sergeant. And when the enemy closed in and your position was overrun, you continued to protect your patients even after you were captured. He paused, and Eleanor saw a muscle in his jaw tighten. What happened after that is documented in the new witness testimony. You were held for 11 days. You were interrogated, and you were subjected to treatment that no human being should have to endure. And through all of it, you refused to give up any information that could have endangered your fellow soldiers. The scars you carry are not signs of disgrace, Sergeant. They are evidence of extraordinary courage. The room was silent. Eleanor could feel the eyes of everyone on her, but she kept her gaze fixed on the secretary. Her heart was pounding and her hands were clenched in her lap, but she did not cry. She had trained herself not to cry, and the training held. The Distinguished Service Cross is the least we can do, Secretary Haynes continued. There are some who believe you should receive the Medal of Honor, and that may still happen. But for now, I wanted to be here personally to make sure you know that your country sees you. Your country is grateful, and your country apologizes for taking so long. Eleanor opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. She had imagined this moment in 100 different ways over the years, but the reality was nothing like her imaginings. It was bigger and stranger and more painful than she had ever expected. The recognition she had never sought was being handed to her, and she did not know how to hold it. Thank you, sir, she finally said, her voice hoarse. I don't know what else to say. You don't have to say anything, the secretary replied. Just be there at the ceremony. Let us honor you. You've earned it. The auditorium was packed. Every available staff member who could be spared from patient care had been invited, and many of the ambulatory patients had been wheeled in as well. The room was arranged with rows of folding chairs facing a small stage, and the flags of the United States and the Department of Veterans Affairs stood on either side of a podium. A military honor guard in dress uniforms lined the walls, their faces impassive and their posture perfect. Eleanor stood in a small room just off the side of the stage, waiting for her cue. She could hear the murmur of the crowd, the shuffle of feet and the rustle of clothing, and she could feel her pulse beating in her temples. She had faced enemy fire with less anxiety than she felt at this moment. Combat, at least, was something she understood. This, standing in front of a room full of people who had known her for years without really knowing her at all, was a different kind of exposure. Kevin appeared at her elbow, his face flushed with excitement. This is incredible, he whispered. Everyone's talking about it. No one can believe it. I mean, we all knew you served, but no one knew you were a hero." "I'm not a hero," Eleanor said automatically. That's exactly what a hero would say. Kevin grinned at her, his enthusiasm undimmed. "I just wanted to tell you that I'm really proud to know you, and I'm sorry that people have been jerks about your scars. They're going to feel pretty stupid after this." Eleanor managed a small smile. "Thank you, Kevin. You've been very kind." Amanda appeared at the door, her expression businesslike. "It's time, Ms. Vance. Please follow me." The ceremony began with a brief introduction from the hospital director, a man named Dr. Wallace, who had been in the position for less than a year and who looked slightly overwhelmed by the magnitude of the event. He spoke about the hospital's mission, about the importance of honoring veterans, and about the privilege of hosting the Secretary of Defense. His remarks were polished and forgettable, and the audience listened with the polite attention of people who were waiting for something more interesting to happen. Then Secretary Haynes took the podium, and the energy in the room shifted. He had the presence of a man who was used to commanding attention, and he did not waste time on pleasantries. "Good morning," he said. "I'm here today to talk about courage. Not the kind of courage that makes headlines or wins elections, but the quiet kind. The kind that doesn't ask for recognition and often doesn't receive it. The kind that walks among us every day, unnoticed and unthanked." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the audience. "In this hospital, you are surrounded by veterans, men and women who wore the uniform and served their country. Some of them served in combat. Some of them bear the scars of that service, visible and invisible, and all of them deserve our respect and our gratitude." Eleanor, standing in the wings, felt her heart rate begin to slow. The secretary's voice was steady and reassuring, and she found herself focusing on his words rather than her own nerves. "But today," Secretary Haynes continued, "I want to tell you about one veteran in particular. A woman who has been working in this hospital for 6 years, caring for her fellow veterans with skill and compassion. A woman whose quiet professionalism has earned the respect of her colleagues, even if the full story of her service has remained unknown. Until now." He turned slightly, gesturing toward the wing where Eleanor stood. "Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sergeant Eleanor Vance, United States Army, retired." The applause was hesitant at first, as if the audience was not quite sure what was happening, and then it swelled into something genuine and sustained. Eleanor walked onto the stage, her legs feeling oddly disconnected from her body, and stood beside the podium. The lights were bright, and she could not see the faces in the audience clearly, but she could feel their attention like a physical weight. "Sergeant Vance," the secretary said, turning to face her, 13 years ago, you were deployed to the Korangal Valley in Afghanistan as a combat medic attached to the 173rd Airborne Brigade. On October 12, 2011, your unit came under heavy attack. 11 soldiers were wounded in the first minutes of the ambush. You, without regard for your own safety, moved through enemy fire to reach the wounded and began treating them where they lay. When the position became untenable, you dragged 7 of your fellow soldiers, one by one, to a more defensible location, all while continuing to provide medical care. The auditorium had gone completely silent. Eleanor could hear her own breathing, slow and deliberate. When the enemy overran your position and you were taken captive, you were subjected to 11 days of brutal treatment. You were interrogated repeatedly. You were given no medical care for your own injuries, and yet you revealed nothing that could have harmed your unit or your country. Your captors used methods that left permanent marks on your body, the scars that some of you in this room may have noticed and wondered about. Those scars are not signs of shame. They are the marks of a hero. Eleanor saw movement in the audience. Someone in the middle rows had stood up, and after a moment she recognized the figure. It was Mr. Davies, his gaunt face pale and his expression unreadable. He was staring at the stage with an intensity that bordered on shock. Beside him, Mrs. Henderson was weeping quietly into a tissue. For your actions that day, and for the courage you displayed during your captivity, the United States Army has awarded you the Distinguished Service Cross," Secretary Haynes said. "It is my honor and my privilege to present it to you now." A uniformed officer stepped forward, carrying a small velvet case. The secretary opened it and removed the medal, a bronze cross suspended from a red, white, and blue ribbon. He pinned it to Eleanor's scrub top with careful precision, and then he stepped back and saluted. Eleanor returned the salute, her hands steady, her eyes dry. The audience erupted into applause, a standing ovation that went on for a long time. Eleanor looked out at the sea of faces, at the people she had worked beside for years, and she felt something shift inside her. The invisible wall she had built around herself, the wall that had kept her safe and isolated for so long, was beginning to crack. And for the first time in years, she did not try to repair it. When the applause finally died down, the secretary spoke again. "Before we conclude, Sergeant Vance has asked to say a few words. I'm told she's not much for speeches, so let's give her your full attention." Eleanor stepped up to the podium. The microphone felt alien in front of her, and she had to resist the urge to step back. She had not prepared any remarks. She had not known what to say until this very moment. But as she looked out at the faces of her colleagues and her patients, the words began to come. "I'm not good at talking about myself," she began, her voice quiet but clear. "I never have been. For a long time I thought that if I just kept my head down and did my work, the past would stay where it belonged. But I've learned that the past doesn't work that way. It follows you. It lives in your skin. It shows up in the way people look at you and in the things they assume." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "I know that some of you have wondered about my scars. Some of you have asked. Some of you have made assumptions. I don't blame you for that. We all make assumptions. But I want to say this. Every person in this hospital, every veteran you treat, every colleague you work beside is carrying something. And you don't always know what it is. So before you judge, before you assume, remember that the person you're looking at might have a story you can't imagine." She glanced down at the medal on her chest, the bronze cross gleaming under the lights. "I didn't ask for this. I didn't expect it. But I'm grateful for it because it means that the truth matters. Even if it takes 13 years to come out, the truth still matters." She stepped back from the podium and the applause began again, louder than before. Eleanor stood on the stage, the medal heavy on her chest, and let herself be seen. The days following the ceremony were a blur of attention and adjustment. Eleanor had never sought the spotlight, but the spotlight found her anyway. Local news stations ran segments on her story, using footage from the ceremony and photographs provided by the Department of Defense. The Columbia Daily Tribune published a front-page article with the headline, "Hidden Hero. VA Nurse Receives Distinguished Service Cross After 13 Years." A national veterans organization reached out to ask if she would speak at their annual conference. Eleanor declined most of the interview requests and all of the speaking invitations, but she could not entirely escape the ripple effects of what had happened. At the hospital, the dynamic shifted in ways both subtle and overt. Colleagues who had passed her in the hallway for years without more than a cursory nod now stopped to offer congratulations and ask questions. Patients who had never given her a second thought now looked at her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. Some of the attention was welcome. Much of it was exhausting. Eleanor had built a life around being invisible, and suddenly she was anything but. Kevin became her unofficial buffer, running interference when well-meaning staff members lingered too long or asked questions that cut too close to the bone. He was protective in a way that was almost endearing, and Eleanor found herself relying on him more than she had ever relied on anyone at the hospital. She still did not share the full details of her captivity. She was not sure she ever would, but she began to open up in small ways, sharing anecdotes about her training, her deployment, the camaraderie of her unit. Kevin listened with the rapt attention of someone who understood that he was being given a gift. Not everyone was pleased by the change in Eleanor's status. Darlene Croft, the charge nurse, became noticeably colder in the weeks following the ceremony. She never openly acknowledged the medal or the secretary's visit, and she treated Eleanor with a clipped, businesslike efficiency that bordered on rudeness. The other nurses noticed, and some of them quietly expressed their solidarity with Eleanor, but Darlene's position as charge nurse gave her a certain amount of institutional power, and she used it in small, petty ways. Eleanor's schedule was changed without consultation. Her requests for time off to deal with the administrative fallout of the medal were delayed or denied. She was assigned the most difficult patients, the ones who required the most physical labor and emotional energy. Eleanor absorbed these slights with the same stoicism that had carried her through far worse, but they wore on her. She came home each evening more tired than she should have been, her body aching and her spirit bruised. Gus, the orange cat, seemed to sense her mood and became even more attentive, curling up on her lap the moment she sat down and purring with a determination that felt almost therapeutic. One evening, about 3 weeks after the ceremony, Eleanor was sitting on her couch with Gus when her phone rang. The caller ID showed a number she did not recognize, but she answered anyway, a habit she had developed since the call from the secretary's office. "Is this Eleanor Vance?" The voice was male, older, with a faint southern accent. "Yes, who is this?" There was a pause, and then the voice said, "This is Thomas Briggs. I don't know if you remember me. I was the medic who replaced you in the unit, after you were taken." Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. Thomas Briggs. She remembered him, a young private first class who had arrived in Afghanistan just a few weeks before the ambush. He had been eager and inexperienced, and she had spent several days showing him the ropes before the attack that changed everything. After she was captured, he had stepped into her role, treating the wounded and keeping them alive until reinforcements arrived. She had often wondered what had become of him. "I remember you," she said, her voice unsteady. "How did you find me?" "The news coverage," Briggs said. "I saw the article about your medal and I knew I had to reach out. I've been trying to track you down for years, but you were hard to find. You kept a low profile." "I did," Eleanor admitted. "I didn't want to be found." "I understand that," Briggs said. "After what happened, I think we all wanted to disappear a little bit, but I've been carrying something for a long time and I need to tell you about it." He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was thicker, heavier with emotion. "I was the one who started the review. I was the new witness they talked about." Eleanor sat very still, the phone pressed to her ear. "You?" "Yes. After the ambush, after you were taken, I treated the wounded and I talked to the survivors. I heard what they said about you, about what you did. I wrote up a recommendation for a medal, but it got buried. The officer who was supposed to forward it, Captain Reynolds, he was one of the ones who got captured with you. He survived, but he was never the same, and he had some things to say that weren't true." Eleanor closed her eyes. Captain Mark Reynolds, the commanding officer of her unit, a man who had been wounded in the initial ambush and captured alongside her. He had been released before she was, due to the severity of his injuries, and he had returned to the United States a broken man. She had heard rumors that he had blamed her for the ambush, claiming that her position had given away their location, but she had never been able to confirm them. By the time she was released and repatriated, the rumors had hardened into something like official suspicion, and her own medal recommendation had been denied without explanation. "Captain Reynolds is dead now," Briggs continued. "He died 3 years ago from complications related to his injuries, but before he died he wrote a letter to the Army, a confession. He admitted that he had lied about you, that he had blamed you to cover up his own mistakes. The letter was found by his family after his death, and they forwarded it to the Department of Defense. That letter, combined with my testimony about what I saw that day, is what reopened your case." Eleanor felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes, tears she had held back for 13 years. Captain Reynolds had blamed her. He had lied, and his lies had cost her not only a medal but years of suspicion and isolation. She thought about all the assumptions people had made about her scars, all the whispers and the sideways glances, and she realized that they traced back to a single act of cowardice by a man who could not face his own failures. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because you deserve to know the truth," Briggs said, "and because I wanted to say I'm sorry. I should have fought harder for you back then. I should have pushed back against Reynolds, demanded an investigation. But I was young and scared, and I just let it go. I've regretted it every day since." "You were a kid," Eleanor said. "You did the best you could." "That's kind of you to say, but it doesn't feel like enough." Briggs paused, and then he said, "I live in St. Louis now. That's not far from Columbia. If you ever want to meet to talk about what happened, I'd like that. I think it might help both of us." Eleanor considered the offer. She had spent so long avoiding the past, running from it, burying it. But the past had found her anyway, and perhaps it was time to stop running. "I'd like that," she said. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." She hung up the phone and sat in the silence of her apartment, the tears finally spilling down her cheeks. Gus meowed softly and pressed his head against her hand, and she stroked his fur as the years of pain and isolation began, slowly, to release their grip. The following week, Darlene Croft escalated her campaign of petty harassment. It started with the schedule changes, which became more egregious. Eleanor found herself assigned to the overnight shift for an entire week, a grueling schedule that left her exhausted and disoriented. When she asked why, Darlene told her that staffing needs required it, and that as a senior nurse, Eleanor should be willing to make sacrifices for the team. The explanation was thin, and everyone knew it, but no one was willing to challenge Darlene directly. Then came the incident with the supply closet. Eleanor had been restocking her cart when Darlene appeared and informed her that the supplies she was using were allocated to a different floor, and that she needed to return them immediately. Eleanor pointed out that the supplies were identical to the ones she had always used, and that there was no formal allocation system in place. Darlene insisted, her voice rising, and the confrontation drew the attention of several other staff members. Eleanor, not wanting to cause a scene, returned the supplies and used older, less effective alternatives from a backup cabinet. The patients on her shift suffered for it, with one elderly veteran developing a minor skin irritation from a cheaper brand of adhesive tape. Kevin was furious when he heard about it. He cornered Eleanor in the break room and demanded to know why she wasn't filing a formal complaint. "She's targeting you," he said, his voice tight with anger. "Everyone can see it. It's because of the medal, because you got attention and she didn't. She's jealous, and she's using her position to make your life miserable." "I know," Eleanor said, sipping her terrible coffee. "But filing a complaint would just make things worse. Darlene has been here for 20 years. She has connections in the administration. A complaint from me would go nowhere, and it would just give her more ammunition." "So you're just going to let her win?" Eleanor set down her cup. "I've survived worse than a petty charge nurse, Kevin. I'll survive this too." But Kevin was not satisfied. He began documenting Darlene's behavior on his own, keeping a detailed log of every instance of unfair treatment he witnessed. He encouraged other nurses to do the same, and slowly, a quiet resistance began to form. Eleanor did not ask for this, and she was not entirely comfortable with it, but she did not stop it either. She had spent too many years being silent, and perhaps it was time to let other people speak on her behalf. The tension came to a head during a staff meeting in early November. Darlene had called the meeting to discuss patient care protocols, but she quickly veered into a critique of the nursing staff's performance. She singled out several people for minor infractions, her voice sharp and dismissive, and when she got to Eleanor, her tone became even more cutting. "And Eleanor," Darlene said, her eyes fixed on her with undisguised hostility, "I've noticed that your documentation has been slipping. 3 charts last week were incomplete, and I had to correct them myself. I expect better from someone with your experience. Or perhaps the medal has made you think you're above the basic requirements of the job." The room went silent. Eleanor felt the eyes of her colleagues on her, and she felt the old instinct to absorb the blow and move on. But something had changed in her over the past few weeks. The medal on her chest, the call from Thomas Briggs, the quiet support of Kevin and the others, all of it had strengthened something inside her that had been dormant for a long time. She stood up, her movements deliberate and calm. "Darling, I'd like to respond to that if I may." Darlene's eyes narrowed, but she nodded curtly. "My documentation was incomplete because I was pulled away from my charting to cover a cardiac emergency on the 4th floor. I informed you of this at the time, and you told me to prioritize the emergency and catch up on the charts later. I did exactly that. The charts were completed by the end of my shift, as per protocol." She paused, her voice steady. "If you have an issue with the way I handled that situation, I'd be happy to discuss it with you and the nursing supervisor. But I don't appreciate being accused of negligence in front of my colleagues, especially when I followed your own instructions." A murmur of agreement rippled through the room. Darlene's face reddened, and she opened her mouth to respond, but Eleanor was not finished. "I've worked here for 6 years," she continued. "I've never had a formal complaint filed against me. My patient outcomes are consistently above the hospital average. I'm not perfect, but I do my job, and I do it well. I don't deserve to be treated like a problem employee just because you don't approve of the attention I've received, and I'm not going to be silent about it anymore." She sat down, her heart pounding but her expression calm. The room was silent for a long moment, and then Kevin began to clap. One by one, the other nurses joined in, until the applause filled the small conference room. Darlene stood at the front of the room, her face a mask of barely controlled fury, and then she turned and walked out without another word. The rebellion had begun. Darlene did not return to work for 3 days. The official explanation was that she was taking personal time, but the rumor mill at the hospital churned with speculation. Some said she had filed a complaint against Eleanor for insubordination. Others said she had been reprimanded by the nursing supervisor after several staff members came forward with their own accounts of her behavior. The truth, as it often did, lay somewhere in between. During Darlene's absence, the atmosphere on the floor changed noticeably. The tension that had been simmering for weeks began to dissipate, replaced by a cautious sense of solidarity. Nurses who had previously kept their heads down started speaking up, sharing their own stories of Darlene's bullying and pettiness. Maria Gonzalez, the evening charge nurse who had always been quietly supportive, began circulating a letter of concern about the work environment, and more than a dozen staff members signed it. Eleanor watched these developments with a mixture of relief and unease. She had not intended to become the center of a workplace uprising, and she worried about the consequences of challenging someone with Darlene's institutional power. But she also recognized that something important was happening, something that went beyond her own grievances. Darlene's behavior had been a problem for years, and the staff had been too afraid to confront it. The medal and the attention it brought had given them the courage to finally speak. On the 4th day, Darlene returned to work. She was subdued in a way that Eleanor had never seen, her usual sharpness blunted into something almost contrite. She avoided eye contact with Eleanor and spoke to the other nurses in a tone that was polite but strained. The nursing supervisor, a calm and competent woman named Patricia Okonkwo, who happened to be Kevin's aunt, had conducted a series of private meetings with staff members during Darlene's absence, and it was clear that some kind of reckoning had occurred. Darlene was still the charge nurse, but her authority had been quietly, effectively checked. For the first time in months, Eleanor felt like she could breathe at work. The petty harassment stopped. Her schedule returned to normal. She was able to focus on her patients without the constant undercurrent of anxiety that had defined her days since the ceremony. She began to remember why she had become a nurse in the first place, the simple satisfaction of caring for people who needed care. Mr. Calloway, the former Marine with pancreatic cancer, noticed the change in her. He was declining steadily now, his body losing the fight against the disease that was consuming him, but his mind remained sharp and his spirit surprisingly resilient. One afternoon, as Eleanor was adjusting his pain medication, he reached out and touched her hand. "You seem different," he said, his voice raspy but clear, "more at peace." Eleanor considered the observation. "I think I am. Something shifted. I'm not sure I can explain it." "You don't have to." He managed a thin smile. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said at the ceremony, about assumptions, about the stories people carry." He paused, gathering his strength. "I was a captain in the Marine Corps infantry. I led men into combat and I made decisions that got some of them killed. I've carried that weight for a long time. People look at me and see a cancer patient, but they don't see the rest of it, the guilt, the nightmares." Eleanor sat down beside his bed, her chart forgotten. "I understand," she said quietly. "I really do." "I know you do." His eyes, still sharp, met hers. "That's why you're a good nurse, not because of the medal, but because you know what it's like to carry something heavy. You don't judge, you just show up and do the work." He leaned back against his pillows, his energy fatting. "My time running out, Eleanor, but I want you to know that you've made a difference. To me and to a lot of other people in this hospital. Don't ever doubt that." Eleanor felt the familiar pressure of tears behind her eyes, but she did not let them fall. "Thank you, Mr. Calloway. That means a great deal." "Richard," he said. "Call me Richard. We're past formalities." She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and she stayed with him until he drifted off to sleep. The breaking point, when it came, arrived from an unexpected direction. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late November, and Eleanor was working a day shift that had been uneventful until a new patient was admitted to her floor. The patient's name was Harold Simmons, a 71-year-old Army veteran who had served in Vietnam and who was being treated for congestive heart failure. He arrived on a gurney, accompanied by his son, a man in his late 40s named Bradley Simmons, who had the aggressive, confrontational manner of someone who was used to getting his way. From the moment Eleanor entered the room to conduct the admission assessment, Bradley Simmons was hostile. He questioned every procedure she performed, demanded to see her credentials, and made a series of disparaging comments about the quality of care at VA hospitals. His father, Harold, was a frail man who seemed embarrassed by his son's behavior, but was too weak to intervene. Eleanor handled the situation with her usual professionalism, answering questions calmly and explaining each step of the process, but she could feel the tension building in the room like static electricity. The situation escalated when she began to take Harold's vital signs. She had to roll up his sleeve to apply the blood pressure cuff, and as she did so, Bradley caught sight of the scars on her forearm. His eyes widened, and then his expression hardened into something ugly. "What is that?" he demanded, pointing at her arm. "What's wrong with your skin?" Eleanor continued with her work, her hands steady. "It's an old injury. It doesn't affect my ability to provide care." "An old injury?" Bradley's voice dripped with contempt. "I've seen that before on the news. You're that nurse, aren't you? The one who got the medal." He took a step closer, his body language threatening. "I read about you. I read what they said you did, and I've got to tell you I don't believe a word of it." Eleanor stopped what she was doing and straightened up, meeting his gaze. "I'm sorry you feel that way, but right now my focus is on your father's health. I'd appreciate it if we could concentrate on that." "No," Bradley said, his voice rising. "I want to talk about this. I served too, 4 years in the Navy, and I know what it takes to get a medal like that. You don't get the Distinguished Service Cross for doing your job. You get it for being in the right place at the right time or for having connections. I've seen it happen. People get medals they don't deserve, and the real heroes get nothing." Eleanor felt her pulse quicken, but she kept her voice calm. "Mr. Simmons, I understand you have strong feelings, but this is not the time or place for this discussion. Your father needs medical care, and I need to complete my assessment." "Don't you tell me what my father needs," Bradley snapped. He turned to Harold, who was lying in the bed with his eyes closed, clearly trying to tune out the confrontation. "Dad, this is the nurse I told you about. The one who got the medal. Look at her scars. You were in Vietnam. You saw real combat. What do you think?" Harold opened his eyes, his expression pained. "Bradley, please, just let the nurse do her job." But Bradley was on a roll now, his anger feeding on itself. "You know what I think? I think those scars are fake. I think she did them to herself, or she got them from some accident and she made up the whole story to get a medal. It happens. People lie about their service all the time. Stolen valor. It's a disgrace." The accusation hit Eleanor like a physical blow. Stolen valor. The phrase was one of the most damning things you could say about a veteran, and Bradley had thrown it at her without a shred of evidence, based on nothing more than his own cynicism and anger. She felt a surge of emotion, anger, hurt, disbelief, and she had to physically restrain herself from responding in kind. Instead, she took a deep breath and spoke in a voice that was carefully, deliberately controlled. "Mr. Simmons, I am going to complete your father's assessment now. If you continue to interfere, I will have to call security and have you removed from the room. I don't want to do that. I want to focus on giving your father the care he deserves, but I will not tolerate being spoken to this way." Bradley stared at her, his jaw working, and for a moment Eleanor thought he was going to escalate further. But then something in his expression shifted and he took a step back. "Fine," he said, his voice sullen. "Do your job, but I'll be watching." He retreated to a chair in the corner of the room and sat down, his arms crossed over his chest, his eyes following Eleanor's every move. She completed the assessment with her usual thoroughness, explaining each step to Harold in a quiet voice, ignoring the hostile presence in the corner. But inside, she was shaken. The accusation of stolen valor had cut deeper than anything Darlene Croft had ever said. It was an attack not just on her competence, but on her integrity, on the very core of her identity. When she left the room, she went straight to the nurse's station and sat down, her legs suddenly weak. Kevin was there, updating a chart. And he looked up with concern when he saw her face. "What happened?" he asked. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor told him, her voice flat and mechanical. Kevin listened, his expression darkening with each word, and when she finished, he set down his pen with a deliberate, controlled motion. "That is completely unacceptable," he said, his voice low and intense. "You need to report this. Immediately. That man accused you of a crime, Eleanor. Stolen valor isn't just an insult, it's a federal offense. He's questioning your service, your medal, your entire identity. You can't let that stand." "I know," Eleanor said, and she was surprised to find that she meant it. The old Eleanor, the one who had spent years avoiding conflict and hiding from the past, would have absorbed the insult and moved on. But she was not that person anymore. The medal, the ceremony, the support of her colleagues, all of it had changed her, or perhaps just revealed the person she had always been beneath the protective shell. She went to Patricia Okonkwo's office and filed a formal complaint. Patricia listened with a grave expression, taking notes and asking clarifying questions, and when Eleanor was finished, she leaned back in her chair and sighed. "I'm sorry this happened," Patricia said. "It's completely out of line and we will take it seriously. I'll speak to the patient and his son and I'll document everything. If Mr. Simmons continues to behave this way, he will be banned from the hospital, regardless of his father's condition. We have a zero-tolerance policy for harassment of staff." "Thank you," Eleanor said. "I appreciate that." "You don't need to thank me. It's my job." Patricia paused, and then she added, "For what it's worth, I believe you. I know your story is true. Anyone who's worked with you for more than 5 minutes can see that you're the real deal. Don't let one angry man make you doubt yourself." Eleanor nodded, feeling some of the tension in her chest begin to ease. "I won't." The formal complaint set in motion a series of events that Eleanor had not anticipated. Patricia spoke to Bradley Simmons later that day, and while the exact content of the conversation was confidential, The result was that Bradley was escorted from the hospital by security and informed that he would not be allowed to return for 72 hours. Harold Simmons, who had been mortified by his son's behavior, apologized to Eleanor personally and asked her to continue as his nurse. She agreed because she believed in taking care of her patients regardless of the circumstances, and because Harold was not responsible for his son's actions. But Bradley did not go quietly. The day after he was banned, a post appeared on a veterans forum online, written by someone using the name Navy Brad 76. The post was titled "Stolen Valor at the VA. Nurse's Medal Story Doesn't Add Up," and it detailed Bradley's version of events, heavily embellished and full of insinuation. The post questioned Eleanor's service record, suggested that her scars were self-inflicted, and demanded an investigation into the circumstances of her medal. It was shared widely on social media, and within 48 hours, it had been picked up by a conservative blog that specialized in stories about government waste and fraud. The blog post did not name Eleanor directly, but it included enough details: her first name, the location of the hospital, the nature of her medal, that she was easily identifiable to anyone who knew her. By the end of the week, the story had spread beyond the online forums and into the local news ecosystem. A reporter from a Columbia television station called the hospital's public relations office, asking for a comment on the allegations. The hospital issued a statement supporting Eleanor and confirming the legitimacy of her medal, but the damage was done. The whispers and the stares that Eleanor had endured for years were back, and this time they came with a public, digital dimension that she had never faced before. She tried to ignore it. She focused on her work, on her patients, on the daily routines that had always been her anchor. But the online harassment was relentless. Anonymous comments appeared on the news articles, calling her a fraud and a liar. Someone found her personal email address and sent a series of messages that were so vicious she deleted them without reading more than a few lines. She began to dread picking up her phone, and she found herself jumping at unexpected noises in her apartment. Kevin was incensed. He spent hours online, tracking the spread of the false story and reporting abusive comments to the platform moderators. He encouraged Eleanor to consider legal action against Bradley Simmons for defamation, but Eleanor was reluctant. She had never wanted to be in the spotlight, and the idea of a public legal battle filled her with dread. She just wanted the whole thing to go away, to return to the quiet, invisible life she had built. But the story would not go away. It continued to circulate, fueled by the insatiable appetite of the internet for controversy and outrage. And in the midst of it all, Eleanor received a letter that changed everything. The letter arrived at her apartment on a Saturday morning, delivered by a courier service that required her signature. It was from the Department of Defense, and it was addressed to her by name. Inside, there was a formal notification that the Army had completed a comprehensive review of her service record and had issued a full, unredacted account of the events of October 12, 2011, and the subsequent captivity. The account, the letter stated, had been officially entered into her permanent record and was available to any authorized party upon request. The letter also noted that the Army's Criminal Investigation Division had opened an inquiry into the allegations of stolen valor being circulated online, and that anyone found to have made false statements about her service could face legal consequences. Eleanor read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling. The Army was not just defending her, it was going on the offensive. The full weight of the United States military was being brought to bear on the people who had tried to discredit her. She had never asked for this, had never imagined it, but she felt a profound sense of relief wash over her. The truth was finally, irrevocably, on the record. She called Kevin and read him the letter over the phone. He was silent for a moment, and then he let out a whoop of triumph that was so loud she had to hold the phone away from her ear. "That's incredible," he shouted. "The Army is going after these people. They're going to shut them down. This is the best possible outcome." "I know," Eleanor said, and she realized she was smiling. "I can't quite believe it." "Believe it," Kevin said. "You've got the entire Department of Defense on your side. That's a pretty powerful ally." He was right, and the implications of that alliance were only beginning to sink in. For 13 years, she had carried the burden of her experience alone, protecting herself with silence and solitude. Now, the institutions she had served were stepping forward to protect her. It was a strange and unfamiliar feeling, but it was also deeply, quietly satisfying. The online harassment did not stop immediately, but it began to lose its momentum. The blog that had first amplified Bradley Simmons' accusations posted a retraction after being contacted by the Army's legal office, and the Veterans Forum took down the original thread and banned the user who had posted it. The local news station that had covered the story ran a follow-up segment that focused on the Army's review and the confirmation of Eleanor's service record. Bradley Simmons, facing the possibility of legal action, issued a public apology that was notably short on specifics but long on regret. And through it all, Eleanor continued to show up for work. She continued to care for her patients, to change bandages and administer medications, and hold the hands of dying veterans. The metal on her chest was heavier than it had been before, but it was a weight she was learning to carry with something that felt almost like pride. The fight back began in earnest on a cold December morning, with a phone call from a man named James Hendricks. Eleanor was at the hospital, finishing her morning rounds, when her cell phone buzzed with an unfamiliar number. She almost let it go to voicemail, but something made her answer. "Ms. Vance, my name is James Hendricks. I'm an attorney with the firm Hendricks and Lowell in Washington, D.C. I specialize in veterans advocacy and military law. I've been following your situation, and I'd like to offer my assistance." Eleanor stepped into an empty patient room, closing the door behind her. "What kind of assistance?" "The kind that makes sure people like Bradley Simmons face consequences for what they've done," Hendricks said. "I've reviewed the online posts, the news coverage, and the formal statements. What happened to you is a textbook case of defamation, and it's compounded by the fact that you're a decorated veteran. There are laws on the books that specifically address this kind of harassment. The Stolen Valor Act of 2013 makes it a federal crime to fraudulently claim military decorations, and while Mr. Simmons hasn't claimed a decoration himself, his accusations against you could be construed as a related offense under certain provisions. More importantly, he's opened himself up to civil liability. You could sue him for damages." Eleanor leaned against the wall, her mind racing. "I'm not interested in a lawsuit. I just want the whole thing to go away." "I understand that," Hendricks said, his voice calm and measured. "But here's the thing, Ms. Vance. These situations don't just go away on their own. If you let this slide, it sends a message that people can attack veterans with impunity. It also leaves you vulnerable to future harassment. I'm not saying you need to pursue a lawsuit. What I'm offering is representation. I can send a cease and desist letter to Mr. Simmons. I can contact the platforms that hosted the defamatory content and demand permanent removals. I can work with the Army's legal team to ensure that the criminal inquiry moves forward. You don't have to do this alone." The word struck a chord. You don't have to do this alone. It was the same message Kevin had been giving her, the same message that was implicit in the Army's letter. She had spent so long believing that she had to carry everything by herself, and the realization that she did not, that there were people and institutions ready to stand beside her, was still sinking in. "All right," she said, "I'll accept your help, but I want to be clear, I'm not doing this for revenge. I'm doing it to protect myself and to make sure this doesn't happen to anyone else." "That's exactly the right reason," Hendricks said. "I'll start working on things today. I'll send you some paperwork to sign, and I'll keep you updated on every step of the process. Welcome to the fight, Ms. Vance." The fight, as Hendricks called it, unfolded over the following weeks with a methodical precision that Eleanor found both reassuring and slightly surreal. The cease and desist letter was delivered to Bradley Simmons' home address by a process server, and within days, Simmons' public apology was posted on the same forums where his accusations had first appeared. Hendricks contacted the conservative blog that had amplified the story and secured a retraction and a permanent removal of the article, along with a commitment from the blog's editors to review their fact-checking procedures. The Army's Criminal Investigation Division continued its inquiry, and while Eleanor was not privy to the details, Hendricks assured her that the process was moving forward. At the hospital, the aftermath of the controversy was still settling. The administration, which had initially been slow to respond to the online attacks, now moved decisively to support Eleanor. A new policy was implemented, mandating that any patient or visitor who harassed staff members would be immediately removed and potentially banned. Security was increased on Eleanor's floor, and Patricia Okonkwo made it clear that she would not tolerate any further incidents. Darlene Croft, meanwhile, had been reassigned. The exact details of the reassignment were not made public, but the rumor mill reported that the letter of concern circulated by the nursing staff had been escalated to the hospital's Human Resources Department, which had conducted a formal investigation. Darlene was transferred to an administrative role in a different building, where she would have no direct supervisory authority over other nurses. It was not the termination that some staff members had hoped for, but it was a significant demotion, and it sent a clear message that the old ways of doing things were no longer acceptable. Eleanor felt a complex mix of emotions when she heard about Darlene's reassignment. On one level, she was relieved. The daily tension of working under a hostile supervisor was gone, and the atmosphere on the floor had improved dramatically. But on another level, she felt a strange, reluctant sympathy. Darlene had been a nurse for decades, and her behavior, while inexcusable, was likely the result of her own unprocessed pain and resentment. Eleanor knew something about carrying pain without processing it, and she could not help but wonder if Darlene, in her own way, was as trapped by the past as she had been. She shared this thought with Kevin one afternoon as they were eating lunch in the cafeteria. Kevin, who had been instrumental in documenting Darlene's behavior, listened thoughtfully and then shook his head. "You're a better person than I am," he said. "After everything she put you through, I would be celebrating her downfall, but you're over here feeling sorry for her." "I'm not feeling sorry for her," Eleanor said. "I just understand how bitterness can take root in a person. I've been there. I spent years pushing people away because I was afraid of being judged. Darlene is doing the same thing, just in a different way. It doesn't excuse her behavior, but it makes it less mysterious." Kevin considered this. "I guess that makes sense, but I still think she got what she deserved." He paused, then grinned. "And speaking of getting what you deserve, have you heard about the award?" Eleanor looked up from her salad. "What award?" "The hospital is nominating you for the Daisy Award. It's a national thing for extraordinary nurses. Someone, I'm not saying who, submitted a nomination letter that talked about your service, your medal, and the way you handled everything that happened. The selection committee is reviewing it now." Eleanor felt a flush of embarrassment. "I don't need another award." "It's not about needing," Kevin said. "It's about recognizing that you're an incredible nurse and an incredible person. And also, it comes with a really nice pin and a sculpture. So there's that." Despite herself, Eleanor laughed. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it felt good. She had not laughed much in the past few months, and the release of it was like a valve opening somewhere deep inside her. The weeks leading up to Christmas were busy at the hospital, as they always were. The holiday season brought an influx of visitors, families coming to see their loved ones, and the staff worked extra shifts to accommodate the increased demand. Eleanor threw herself into the work with a renewed sense of purpose. The external battles were being handled by her attorney and the Army, and she was free to focus on what she did best, caring for her patients. One of those patients was Mr. Calloway, who had taken a sharp turn for the worse in early December. The cancer had spread to his liver and his lungs, and the doctors had given him only weeks to live. His wife, Patricia, was at his bedside nearly every day, her face drawn with exhaustion and grief. Eleanor spent as much time with them as her schedule allowed, adjusting medications to keep Richard comfortable, talking to Patricia about what to expect in the final days, and simply being present in a way that felt more like friendship than nursing. On the evening of December 18th, Richard Calloway died. He went peacefully, with his wife holding his hand and Eleanor standing quietly at the foot of the bed. It was the first death Eleanor had witnessed since the ceremony, and it hit her harder than she expected. She had seen death many times before, in combat and in the hospital, but something about Richard's passing, the quiet dignity of it, the way he had faced his illness with the same courage he had shown as a Marine, moved her deeply. After the body was taken away and Patricia had gone home to be with her family, Eleanor sat alone in the empty room for a long time. The bed was stripped, the sheets bundled into a laundry bag, the monitors turned off. The room felt hollow, a space that had been occupied by a person and was now just a room again. She thought about Richard's words to her, about the weight he had carried and the way he had seen her own weight without judgment. She thought about the medal on her chest and the scars on her body, and she thought about all the years she had spent hiding from both. And she made a decision, a quiet, private decision that she did not share with anyone, not even Kevin. She was going to stop hiding, not just from the public, but from herself. She was going to face the memories she had suppressed for 13 years, the memories of captivity and pain and survival, and she was going to find a way to integrate them into the person she had become. She did not know exactly how she was going to do this, but she knew that it was time. The following week, she called Thomas Briggs, the medic who had replaced her in Afghanistan and who had started the review that led to her medal. He answered on the second ring, and she asked him if his offer to meet still stood. He said it did, and they made plans to get together on the weekend after New Year's. On Christmas Eve, Eleanor worked a half shift and then went home to her apartment. Gus met her at the door, as always, and she fed him his dinner and then sat on the couch with a cup of tea and a book. Outside, the maple trees were bare, their branches black against the gray winter sky. The world was quiet in the way that only Christmas Eve could be, a stillness that felt almost sacred. She thought about calling her parents. They lived in a retirement community in Arizona now, and they spoke on the phone every few months. Her relationship with them had been strained since her return from Afghanistan. They had never understood what she had been through, and she had never been able to explain it. The medal had changed things, though. Her mother had called after the ceremony, her voice thick with tears, and they had talked for over an hour for the first time in years. It was not a complete reconciliation, but it was a start. She thought about calling Kevin, who was spending the holiday with his aunt's family and had invited her to join them. She had declined, not because she did not want to go, but because she needed some time alone. The events of the past few months had been overwhelming, and solitude, which had once been her prison, was now becoming a refuge she could choose rather than a sentence she had to endure. Instead of calling anyone, she opened her laptop and began to write. She had never been a writer, had never kept a journal or written letters, but something about the stillness of the evening compelled her to put words on the page. She wrote about the ambush, about the hours of dragging wounded soldiers to safety, about the moment of capture and the 11 days that followed. She wrote about the pain and the fear and the strange, stubborn hope that had kept her alive. She wrote about coming home, about the silence and the assumptions and the years of invisible struggle. And she wrote about the medal, about the ceremony, about the moment when the Secretary of Defense had pinned the bronze cross to her chest and everything had changed. She wrote until her fingers ached and the tea had gone cold. When she finally stopped, it was past midnight and Christmas morning had arrived. She saved the document and closed the laptop, and she felt lighter than she had in years. The words were not for anyone else, not yet. They were just for her, a record of the truth that she had carried for so long. but the act of writing them down, of giving them form and shape and sequence, was a kind of liberation. The past was no longer a formless weight inside her. It was a story, and it was hers. The new year arrived with a blast of cold air and a dusting of snow that turned the streets of Columbia into a treacherous mess of ice and slush. Eleanor spent New Year's Day at her apartment, watching the snow fall and finishing the last chapters of the book she had been reading for months. Gus was curled up on the arm of the couch, his tail twitching occasionally as he dreamed his cat dreams, and the apartment was warm and quiet and safe. The meeting with Thomas Briggs was scheduled for the first Saturday of January, and Eleanor found herself both dreading it and looking forward to it in equal measure. She had not seen Briggs since the day of the ambush, when he had been a scared young private who barely knew how to hold a pressure bandage. Now he was a middle-aged man with a family and a career as a physician's assistant in St. Louis. His life, like hers, had been shaped by that day in the Koringal Valley, and she was curious to see how he had carried the weight. They met at a diner on the outskirts of Columbia, a classic Midwestern establishment with vinyl booths and a pie case that took up half the counter. Eleanor arrived first and took a booth by the window, watching the parking lot through the frost-covered glass. When Briggs walked in, she recognized him immediately, even though he looked nothing like the young soldier she remembered. His hair was gray now, and his face was lined, and he walked with a slight limp that she had not expected. But his eyes were the same, wide and earnest and a little bit haunted. He slid into the booth across from her, and for a moment they just looked at each other. Then Briggs smiled, a tentative, almost shy expression, and extended his hand. "Sergeant Vance," he said, "it's been a long time." "It has," Eleanor agreed, shaking his hand. "And it's just Eleanor now. I've been out of the army for a long time." "Old habits," Briggs said, his smile widening. "I've been calling you Sergeant Vance in my head for 13 years. It's going to take a while to adjust." They ordered coffee and pie, apple for Eleanor, cherry for Briggs, and they talked. At first, the conversation was careful, circling around the edges of the subject that had brought them together. They talked about their jobs, their families, the strange turns their lives had taken since leaving the military. Briggs was married with 2 teenage daughters, and he spoke about them with a warmth that was evident in every word. Eleanor talked about her work at the VA, about Kevin and the other nurses, about the cat that had adopted her. The small talk was a buffer, a way of easing into the deeper waters that lay ahead. Eventually, inevitably, the conversation turned to the ambush. Briggs spoke first, describing the chaos of that day from his perspective. The sudden eruption of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, the overwhelming fear of a young soldier who had never seen combat. He talked about watching Eleanor move through the fire, calm and deliberate, as if she were immune to the bullets that were tearing up the ground around her. "I'd never seen anything like it," he said, his voice quiet with the weight of memory. "You were so steady. You just kept going from one wounded soldier to the next, never stopping, never hesitating. I was frozen. I couldn't move. And you looked at me and said, 'Private, I need you to hold this bandage.' And your voice was so calm that it snapped me out of it. I started helping you and I kept helping you until—" He trailed off, his eyes dropping to the table. "Until I was captured," Eleanor finished for him. Briggs nodded. "I saw them take you, 3 men with rifles. You had your hands up, but you weren't afraid, or if you were, you didn't show it. They dragged you away, and I thought—" He paused, his voice cracking. "I thought I would never see you again. I thought you were dead." Eleanor reached across the table and placed her hand on his. "I thought I was dead too," she said. "But I was, and neither were you. We both survived." Briggs looked up, his eyes glistening. "I've carried that day with me every single day for 13 years. The things I saw, the things I did and didn't do. I used to have nightmares. I still do sometimes. But when I saw that article about your medal, I felt like I could finally do something. I could finally tell the truth about what happened, about what you did. It was the least I could do." "It was more than the least," Eleanor said. "It was everything. You gave me back my story. You gave me back my name." She squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Thomas, for all of it." They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the diner fading into the background. Then Briggs cleared his throat and pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "There's something else," he said. "Something I wanted to give you in person." He unfolded the paper and slid it across the table. It was a photocopy of a handwritten letter, the script neat and precise, the paper yellowed with age. Eleanor picked it up and began to read. The letter was dated November 3rd, 2011, just a few weeks after the ambush. It was addressed to the commanding officer of the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and it was a formal recommendation that Sergeant Eleanor Vance be awarded the Medal of Honor for her actions on October 12th. The recommendation was signed by Private First Class Thomas Briggs, and it detailed, in clear and specific language, everything Eleanor had done that day. The soldiers she had treated, the wounds she had dressed, the lives she had saved. It described her capture and expressed the author's conviction that she had continued to demonstrate extraordinary heroism even in captivity. Eleanor read the letter twice, her hands trembling. "You wrote this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You recommended me for the Medal of Honor." "I did," Briggs said. "I wrote it the day after you were taken, while everything was still fresh. I gave it to Captain Reynolds, and I assumed he would forward it up the chain of command. But he didn't. He buried it. He lied about you, and he buried my recommendation, and you never got the recognition you deserved." He took a deep breath. "I found out about it years later, after Reynolds died. His family found the letter in his personal effects, along with a bunch of other documents he had suppressed. That was what started the whole review. That letter, combined with my testimony and Reynolds' deathbed confession." Eleanor stared at the letter, the words blurring slightly as tears filled her eyes. She had spent years believing that no one had recognized what she had done, that her actions had been forgotten or dismissed. But the truth was that someone had recognized her. A scared young private had seen her heroism and had tried to make sure the world knew about it. His effort had been thwarted by a cowardly officer, but it had not been in vain. 13 years later, it had finally borne fruit. "I don't know what to say," she said. "You don't have to say anything," Briggs replied. "I just wanted you to see it. I wanted you to